Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, Trevor W. Harrison, talking about his new book, Tales This Side of the Elysian Fields. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Worldshapers, the podcast where I talk to other authors about their latest books. My name is Edward Willett. I am myself an author primarily of science fiction and fantasy, but also nonfiction and other things. I'm also a publisher, and it's because I'm a publisher that recently this podcast has focused on authors that I am publishing. And that will continue today. And in the new year, well, I hope to increase the mix of authors who I'm not publishing, but I've still got a lot of authors I'm publishing that I want to keep talking to in a variety of genres. Just to show, today's guest is going to be the author of Tales This Side of the Elysian Fields, Trevor W. Harrison. This is travel memoirs. That doesn't quite do it justice. Well, you'll find out more in today's episode. That one just came out. And then coming out tomorrow, as I record this, they'll already be out by the time you see this. New science fiction novel, Ashme's Song by Brad C. Anderson, whom I've already interviewed on this podcast. So you can go back and listen to that interview with Brad C. Anderson. I also published a reprint of his book, Duotero, a while ago, but this one is a brand new science fiction novel just out from Shadowpaw Press. And then this one is a reprint, so technically it's Shadowpaw Press Reprise. So we've got all three of my imprints here: Shadowpaw Press Reprise, Ashme's Song is Shadowpaw Press, and Tales This Side of the Elysian Fields is Endless Sky Books, but they're all part of Shadowpaw Press. This is a literary novel, an award-winning literary novel from, it first came out in the mid-1990s, late 1990s from Thistledown Press here in Saskatchewan. And it's about an unusual child born into a family and kind of the way the family swirls around this unusual child and the dreams they have and the secrets they have and all that sort of thing. I highly recommend it. I hope to talk to Harriet in the future, but that'll be in the new year if that happens. All right. So those are the three that I've most recently published. And then coming up, I've got one of my own, Fireboy, a middle grade fantasy novel, is coming up in July of next year. Another science fiction novel, Gods of a New World by Ryan Melsom, comes out in June. Then I've got another book by Harriet, a collection of her short fiction, another reprint. I have another reprint called Cupboard Love, a dictionary of culinary curiosities by Mark Morton, who wrote The Headmasters that I also published, the young adult science fiction novel that came out not quite a year ago now. And that one's coming out in a reprint. And then I've also got a reprint of The Night Girl by James Bowe, who I interviewed not too long ago about his book, The Sunrunners. That'll be coming out. And and then there's two literary novels, David Carpenter's Hello, as not novels, they're short fiction collections, Hello, and then Dwayne Brenna's Theories of Everything. Those are two Saskatchewan authors. And I'll be talking to them, I hope, in the new year as well. So you can see what I mean when I say I've got a lot of my own authors to talk to, but I do hope to expand this to other authors again, perhaps once I've worked through some of those. Anyway, it is what it is. The Worldshapers will continue, and I hope that you will continue to come and listen to me talk to these authors. And that brings us to this week's guest, Trevor W. Harrison. Let's meet him now. So, Trevor, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Happy to be here, Ed.
You're the latest in a series of authors I've interviewed that I'm actually the publisher for. Excuse me. And this is the book in question we'll be talking about. I will hold it up. It's actually backwards to me when I look at it, but I know it's not in the recording. Tales, sorry, now I have a frog in my throat. Tales This Side of the Elysian Fields. It just came out 6 days ago as we record this. And when it goes live, it'll be less than 2 weeks ago. So it's very fresh, not exactly hot off the press, but pretty darn close. So let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. And tell me about yourself, your biographical details, and especially how your life led to this book.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. Well, I grew up in Edmonton, and over the years I traveled across the prairies with my family and worked for a time in Manitoba, worked in various parts of Alberta from the north to the south and parts in between. And I did degrees at the University of Winnipeg, University of Calgary, and the University of Alberta. And even though I have an academic career, and I think reasonably well known actually in academic circles, but at the same time, I also still on the side kind of wrote poetry, short stories, and everything else from time I was actually a teenager and into my 20s. And at that time, when I would travel around, I quite often kept fairly good notes of places I was and even conversations I had with people. I'm now retired as an academic, but I ended up sort of falling back on some of the things that I started to write years ago. And lo and behold, I was looking through quite literally a suitcase of diary notes and everything. And I thought, well, this is actually there's some stuff I think is kind of interesting here, and perhaps readers would like to read it. And so I put together this book, and it's really a collection of kind of short autobiographical stories of places I worked, things I did, people I saw along the way. Lots of travel stories, but also stories about working in different places as well that I think some people will find some resonance perhaps in their own lives.
Were you interested in writing as a young person? Did you mentioned you've done poetry, things like that? Did that start fairly early for you?
Yeah, actually, I was writing poetry in my teen years, and the last few years I've actually gone back to writing some poetry again. A little bit of it has been published, and I may actually try to put together a collection of poetry at some point. I actually do have a self-published, book of poetry from a few years back, so I may go back to that again. But early on, actually, I think before I entered into a kind of academic career, I was, thought of myself as perhaps becoming a journalist, or again, kind of a writer in the vein of Ernest Hemingway or someone like that. So that was part of the motivation for keeping notes at the time was, I thought observing people and writing about events was kind of something that I did kind of naturally. So in some ways, this is kind of going back to interests I had, as I said, as a teenager or in my 20s.
We mentioned Hemingway. Were you a big reader? Is that one reason that you were drawn to the written word as a way of communicating?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a big reader, but I read. I would get sort of into certain authors at times. I would read everything I could find of theirs for a while. So Hemingway was one of them. Faulkner, Kafka, actually, for a while I would read everything. So but Hemingway was certainly some influence for me, and it's not a bad influence for writers, I have to say.
No, no, certainly not. And then you mentioned your academic career. You were at the University of Lethbridge, and you're a professor emeritus, which I always is that just a fancy way of saying retired?
It is a fancy way of retired. Yeah, basically. So we can just say retired.
And your field was sociology, and you've also done quite a bit of commentary. It says in your bio that you're well known and for contributions to public media. What has that looked like over the years?
Yeah, actually, every time certainly we had an election here in 2023 in Alberta, and for a month or so before the election, actually, I was every day I was getting two and three calls from radio, television, print media, wanting me to comment or ask questions about various kinds of things. So, yeah, I'm in that circle. I'm reasonably well known, and yeah, so it's just another part of my career life that I've ended up doing that. One of the effects of that, I think, is that I'm also there's a term sometimes used with academics. Are you a public intellectual? And I guess I classify as that because I whatever I would research, I don't mind talking to the public about it and kind of bridging that gap that sometimes exists between academics and kind of the lay public. And in that vein, I've got quite used to actually doing a lot of kind of media stuff. In fact, this coming Thursday, 3 days from now, it'll be December 19th. I'm actually giving a public talk here in Lethbridge, going over and reviewing the recent American election. So it's the kind of thing that I quite often get asked to do. Um, to be honest, one of the things too that I enjoy is working between different forms of communication, but also different forms of writing. And so there is a kind of format for doing academic writing, but there's also when you're writing short stories and or poetry or something else, working within those different veins, I find actually exciting to work between them. And when I would write academic things in the past, sometimes I would even sneak in literary allusions. So it's not an unusual thing that I would head off an academic article with a quote from a poet of some sort as well, T.S. Eliot or whatever, because I think that there's a stylistically, but also engaging the public. Academics sometimes are not very good at that. So using literary devices to pull people in, I think, is actually a very effective technique. And
I
so,
was
as I
going to.
said, over the years, I've got used to kind of moving between those different forms of writing.
So it sounds like there is a cross pollination going on among the various ways that you write. I've often said, because my writing, although I think of myself primarily as a science fiction fantasy author, in fact, I've written way more nonfiction than I have that. And I was a
Mhm.
journalist. That was my background as a
Right.
newspaper reporter and editor. But it's all writing, and it's all trying to communicate ideas clearly to somebody, taking that thing that's in your head and then reconstructing it on the page just using words.
Oh, I agree totally. And again, I think in the back of my mind, I always thought I could end up being a journalist, perhaps like a foreign correspondent. I think of people like Joe Schlesinger, I greatly admire. Um, but I think if I could fault academics for anything particularly, is that academics sometimes are not very good actually in communicating with the public. Might have great ideas, but it takes a certain knack to know how to do that. And so, yeah, it's something I take pride in actually trying to do. And so this is just another form of writing. People, when they pick up this book, will actually find at times also there's a few, not many. I don't want to bore people with them, but there are, as you know, a few little footnotes there
Yes.
that will refer to, here is a kind of a source if you want to look up something more about, for example, Generalissimo Franco, then you can go look to this source there. So,
So when you went back and, well, first of all, how did you how did you end up doing so much travel as a young man to such interesting places? Because at one point you're a an extra in a biblical epic, and you're attending bullfights in Barcelona, and you're living on a hippie beach in Greece. So how did you manage all that travel as a young man?
well, I think times have changed a great deal, and much for the worse. I think I do think that one of the best educations that anybody can ever have actually is travel. You get to see things and talk to people and realize that at base a lot of people are really the same, but we live in different contexts and places. So it's a wonderful experience. And of course, years ago there was a kind of a cultural thing in the 60s and into the 70s and a bit later where young people, before settling down to a career of some sort, would take off and travel someplace. And it was a little bit easier, I think. Then it was a little bit cheaper to do it, but so I would end up kind of backpacking around, and because I hadn't settled down to any career, nope, I wasn't married, I wasn't in any firm relationship, and so doing that kind of thing was just part of the times, I think. I should add here actually that just very about 2 weeks ago, I just returned from a 3 week backpacking trip with my son, who's now 32. I don't know how that happened since I'm only 45 myself. But the we've traveled to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, and it felt kind of like being 25 again and traveling around to these places and just seeing things, taking in museums and sites, and talking with people. So it's still very much part of my way of thinking about myself and the world that I live in. But and it course, the world is a much more dangerous place in some ways now, but I do think it's a shame that young people don't have that experience, or even older people who do travel, because I think it's a wonderful experience, and the world would be better if we all got to see each other in our venues.
Is the world more dangerous now, or are we just more aware of the dangers than perhaps people were when they were traipsing around in the
It's
70s and 80s?
probably a little bit of both, and also part of it is I think that to some extent, obviously, one doesn't want to walk into a war zone, but to some extent, I think people now are feel that it's far more dangerous than it is in some places. That if you are smart about it and you don't go into dangerous places at certain times of night, like 3 in the morning, then you're probably reasonably well off. But I think there is an apprehension out there for people that feel now they need to travel in a kind of cocoon. Otherwise, there's dragons out there someplace. Yeah.
Here there be dragons, yes. When you went back to the notes, what did those notes look like? Were they very detailed or sketches? What exactly, what kind of notes did you take?
Yeah, some of them actually, when I went back to it, I was surprised myself at how detailed it was. One of the things I think I was very good at, and I'm not quite sure I'm as good at it now. I've always been really interested in language and also how people speak, and catching just phrases. And so I actually would keep pretty good notes of conversations I had with people everywhere. So when I translated some of the notes I had into these stories, some of them were pretty much they wrote themselves. They were already there on the page. Sometimes I maybe had to elaborate or you know add a few words here and there, but some of the notes were actually very complete in places. And of course, although years have gone by in some instances, of course, I wanted to protect the innocent. Not protecting me particularly, but so you have to, of course, use pseudonyms or something. But no, a lot of the notes were actually very complete at that time, and memory does help as well. Plus, here and there, a few photos, of course, that also add in details you might have missed.
Did you find sometimes you read the notes and memory filled in gaps, but sometimes you read the notes, you think, I don't remember that.
Well, yeah, going over the notes was actually kind of a trip back memory lane in some ways, because it was like, oh, wow, this is me speaking when I'm 22, 23, whatever. And it was a nice jolt, put it that way. It was kind of I got to reacquaint myself with my older self in some ways, and it wasn't altogether a bad self to meet again.
What was your actual writing process for the book? Did you, well, first of all, you had to decide what essays or what you were going to write, but then did you just sit down and start to finish on them, or did you do some kind of outlining of the whole book? Or this podcast has always talked about writing process, so I always add those questions in there.
Yeah, no, and I think I myself have I'm fascinated always listening to other writers about the process of how they go about this. One thing I should say is that in terms of a lot of notes, I actually have another book that's going to be coming out in the spring with Athabasca University Press. And that book actually details more particularly a trip across the Middle East through Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan and India in 1976, 77. And that one, again, I kept a lot of notes. Now, that book is going to be a bit more academic than this one is. But it was in the course of going through some of those notes that I also reacquainted myself with some of these other notes. And these ones were over a wider expanse of time, different kind of experiences. A couple of the stories there, as you mentioned, about my adventures in a movie career, was during that same period of time as this other book is going to detail. But then there were all these other notes. And so as I was looking through them, I thought, well, I think there's something here that maybe is interesting for some readers. And I actually sent on a rough draft of some of these, a variety of stories to a friend of mine, another writer, Elizabeth McLaughlin, who was here in Lethbridge, but she's now relocated out to Surrey, BC. And she read it over and she gave me some suggestions about which stories perhaps didn't fit as well, or the tone was different, or whatever. Maybe leave those out. But she said, I think there is a book here. And so I thought, oh, well, I have some validation. Maybe there's a book here. So then I went back and began to go over the books and think, okay, or the stories, and think, how can I put them together in a book? So the two parts that, in some sense, it needed a connecting thread, it seemed to me, or something to set off the rest of the stories. And that's the first chapter in the book, as you know, which is called 19, an introduction, which really kind of details my life up to the point when I then sort of left home and start to travel. So that's kind of a fresh look at it. And again, it contextualizes the rest of the book. There is another chapter actually there, which is referred to as dumbass jobs, which talks about really terrible jobs that you have when you're in your late teens, early 20s. Again, which suggests though that you're fancy free and you're not tied down to any kind of jobs. And so, as you mentioned, you can travel around and do other kinds of things that are far more interesting than some of these other jobs. So those kind of contextual pieces are part of the book itself. But many of the other chapters, then I started to go through the notes and write up. And again, the notes were fairly complete, but here and there I had to add maybe a little bit of contextual stuff, just so the reader could understand the stories a little bit better. And I always think there's a wonderful song by Bob Seger where he talks about writing music, and he says, the art of thinking about what you leave in and what you leave out. That's part of writing also, because the reader reading it doesn't want to be inundated with all kinds of trivial stuff. So you need to get to the point, and yet you need to give enough stuff that the reader understands what you're talking about here. So part of that, even in going through the notes, was how much to leave in and how much to leave out, and where to insert things that again help for the reader to understand it.
Are you a fast writer or a slow writer?
This case, I would say I'm was fairly fast. I suspect there's a lot of writers this way. Every time I've ever written anything, and that includes my academic writing, uh, within days after it's been published or it's been sent for publication, I'm saying, geez, I could do that so much better. I really want to redo that sentence. So I'm a little bit anal when it comes to actually writing. That slows down the processes to some extent. In this case, though, because the notes were actually fairly complete, this book took altogether probably about a year and a half or so, maybe 2 years total. The other book that I'm working on, that will be coming out in the spring, that is a long suffering project, which at the end of the day is going to have taken 15 or 16 years to finally come up with the proper format, and again, dealing with a lot of things to leave in, leave out, etc., etc. So to answer your question more succinctly, depends what it is that I'm actually working on. But I am very conscious of every word. For me, every word is important in my writing. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about the precise word that I want here to get across an idea. And it's actually something I used to emphasize to my students when I was teaching, was there are thousands of words out there. And in the English language, sometimes you have a dozen words that sound kind of the same and sort of are the same. Your task in writing is to pick the one word that best expresses what you're trying to say. And if you can use that kind of precision, you're probably on your way to being a decent writer.
Do you get any? You mentioned sort of early on sharing some of these stories with someone, a writer friend who told you there was a book there. When you get closer to completing it, do you share it with someone to get feedback before it comes to me as the editor?
Well, one of my best people to give who gives feedback to me is actually my wife, Terry. She's been a quasi editor over the years. She is she's a good grammarian, so she will pick up on things that. And as you know, Ed, one of the problems though of writing anything and rewriting things is the longer you work on things, the less likely you're actually able to read it yourself. You cannot any longer actually see things. And so sometimes it's just very stupid little things creep in there. Like you missed a word someplace because it was in your brain, but
Yeah,
it didn't
that's
get
very
down on the
common.
paper, right?
Yeah.
Because you're switching things around and things get lost. So she's a chief editor for me, and but between my own notes, uh, Elizabeth's comments, and then Terry's comments again, and just reworking it, that was my basic process on this one.
Well, it was very enjoyable for me to edit and to read the essays. Do you have a favorite one?
Oh, that's a uh,
I don't know.
that's a tough
What's
one.
your favorite child? Who's your favorite? Which child is your
Yeah,
favorite?
my favorite child here. I think I actually really enjoyed. There's one there, my railway career.
Oh, yes.
I actually really, and that one again, the notes were really fairly precise. These conversations with working with these people who I really quite enjoyed, even though I was really not very good at this job. I mean, I was like 19 or 20, but that came off for me again. I was taken back immediately to doing this very hard job in a very cold fall, and my fingers, I think, started to sting again from the cold of holding on to metal as as I rewrote that chapter. That was a favorite for me for sure.
Well, as we said, the book came out not that long ago, very briefly ago. You have some events. You mentioned, well, I think one has already happened, but you're hoping to have some other launch events. Do you have anything pinned down there yet?
I know I actually have an interview tomorrow morning on Zoom, I believe. And then there's a couple more that are set up for early February. We have an official book launch here in on January 15th in Lethbridge, and we're in the process of trying to set up a couple of other book launches in Edmonton and Calgary. So it's actually going along really well, and I'm happy with the reception so far from people who have read and looked at the book and read about it. So yeah, it's going along actually well, I think.
What we've forgotten to mention, or I have, is the cover art, which you provided from a painter friend. So tell me about the art.
I'm glad you brought that up, Ed. That's that's a for me a very personal touch to this. So when I knew that the that you accepted to publish this book, very grateful for that. The next thing is okay. What are we going to have for a book cover? And as it turns out, I have a friend who is now retired, but she had started doing painting into her early 60s or so, kind of a post retirement thing. And much surprisingly, she just picked up on it. She is actually quite a remarkable artist. So I suggested to her early this year ending that perhaps she had something that she could do as an artwork for it. While she's been perfecting her career as an artist, she's been asking people for photographs that she could perhaps end up painting. And I had this old photo from Manitoba. It's actually a picture from Lake Dauphin, where I have relatives around, that I took over 20 years ago. And I sent it to her. And she said that'd be a great painting. So she started working on it. At the end of the day, we settled on that painting that she did as the cover for it. And so Colleen Bacher, who did the artwork, we're glad that she offered the picture to be used on the cover, and I'm really happy with it. So it adds a personal touch that on my book I have on the cover a photo of a painting done by also a good friend. I should add that the actual painting, in fact, now sits in our kitchen as well. So we actually have the artwork on our wall. So it's very
I have
much
a
a personal touch.
cover art right there from my first book. And we also should mention the title, Tales This Side of the Elysian Fields. The Elysian Fields, of course, are where the favored Greek dead went. But they are dead. So I guess this side of the Elysian Fields means you ain't dead yet.
I'm not dead yet, and maybe a brief mention about how the title comes about. People will actually have to buy the book and read the first chapter to tell where the allusion to the Elysian Fields is.
The Elysian
But
illusion.
but having settled on the title, I then went back. I thought, well, just a second here. Something clicked in my brain that it didn't exactly, as you said, it's for warriors going off and after they've died, it's kind of the Valhalla or heaven for warriors. And I thought, well, I'm not dead yet. So hence this side of the Elysian Fields seemed like a much more apt title for this.
Although I'm sure a book from the other side of the Elysian Fields would sell really well if you could if you could arrange
Well,
that.
if I can pull it off, Ed, we can look for it being a sequel.
Well, thanks so much, Trevor, for being on. You talked a little bit about what you're working on already. So that's normally my next question, but we know what that is. It's this book about your travels across the Mideast. Do you have, and you said something about poetry. Is that coming along or?
It is actually. I have a quite a swath of poetry I've been working on, and again I think my insistence on precision and language is I'm fairly happy with a lot of the poetry I'm writing at the moment. The other thing actually down the road, and this will be a totally new adventure for me, but I'm in the process of sketching out also a number of fictional short stories. So if I'm able to do it, and one of the one of the things, of course, all writers lack is time.
Hmm.
So if I had more time and I didn't have interruptions of some sort, but I am working, as I said, then on the idea of a collection of short fiction and also poetry. So beyond the book that'll be coming out in the spring, I'm hoping that I will have a couple of other things to bring forward, and perhaps through your good office, we will be doing some other work together here down the road.
Perhaps. So thanks, Trevor, for being on. And
Thank you.
the book again is Tales This Side of the Elysian Fields. It's through the Endless Sky Books imprint of Shadowpaw Press, available in ebook and sorry to say audiobook. We don't have an audiobook version, unfortunately, but through you should record one. Through ebook and also in print and widely available everywhere. If a bookstore doesn't have it, they can certainly order it. So thanks for this, and good luck as the book continues to find its way out into the wider world.
Thank you.
And thanks again to Trevor for that conversation. I enjoyed talking to him, and I really enjoyed working on his book, and I think you would enjoy reading it. You can get it anywhere, as we said, including directly from Shadowpaw Press at shadowpawpress.com, which ties nicely into my telling you about where you can find me and all these various things. Shadowpawpress.com is one of them. You can also find Shadowpaw Press online. It's on X at Shadowpaw Press. It's on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press. It's on Facebook at Instagram. Yeah, I know. Facebook at Shadowpaw Press, and it's on Blue Sky at Shadowpaw Press. However that one works, I'm not really up on Blue Sky, but I do have an account there that I mirror stuff on from other places. And of course, Endless Sky Books has its own website, endless-sky-books.com, but you can also find those books on the main shadowpawpress.com website. You can find me at edwardwillett.com. You can find me on X/Twitter at ewillett. You can find me on Blue Sky now at Edward Willett. You can find me on Instagram at Edward Willett Author. You can find me on Facebook at Edward.Willett. I think that covers most of them. Well, YouTube, that's what I forgot. You can find me on YouTube at Edward Willett, where you can also find this podcast. I post this on the Edward Willett YouTube channel. And one of the other things you can find on that channel is, you can walk around Regina with me. I often live stream my walks around the city and blab as I go. So it's kind of a vlog. As you can tell, I talk. So it's not a big jump from here to there, except it's outside and I'm walking while I do it. That's it for this episode of The Worldshapers. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you will continue to come back as I continue to talk to authors. I did forget to mention two things for The Worldshapers. You can find it on X at The Worldshapers. You can find it on Facebook at The Worldshapers, and its own website is theworldshapers.com. There. That really does cover everything. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back in the future sometime. Bye for now.